This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Ixalan, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We're in the midst of Lost Caverns of Ixalan preview season, and my set review will be starting this coming week on November 3rd. So that means it's time to take an early look at the set. Before we have all the previews out, I like to do a video like this one where I talk about the set's mechanics and how I think they'll fare. Before we get into that though, I want to tell you about some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. If you are either of those things, you get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and then at the end of the set review, you'll also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades. You can find out how to be a channel member or a patron by using links in the description. Alright, so let's dive in with a look at this set's mechanics. There are a few mechanics that appear like as one-ofs in the set that I'm not going to talk about here. Well, either they appear as one-ofs or we see them all the time now, so at this point, talking about them as if they're like a special mechanic in this set seems like kind of a waste of time, and those are double-faced cards, so we have transforming double-faced cards in this set. Sagas, there's at least one of those, but only one side of the card is a saga. We've also got land cycling, which we've seen several times lately, as well as battle cry and adventure. These are, I think battle cry is only going to be on one card, and I'm almost entirely certain adventure will only be on one card. These aren't really set mechanics. They just do this now where they put a few cards in a set that have a specific mechanic, especially if the card is from, or the character on the card is from like a different plane, where, for example, an adventure is a thing. We have a character from Eldraine visiting, and they have an adventure as a result. So we're not going to talk about those. We've seen them all the time, or they only appear on one card anyway. But there are plenty of mechanics to talk about in this set. One of them is a returning mechanic, and that is Explore. This is one of my favorite mechanics. I love little card selection mechanics, and that's what this is. So we have it on a card like Nizzanotes Scout, which is a 1-mana 1/1, and when it enters the battlefield, it explores. Pretty simple, right? That means you reveal the top card of your library, put that card into your hand if it's a land, otherwise put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, then put that card back or put it into your graveyard. So, lots going on here. This 1-mana 1/1 looks really good. It reminds me of something like Voldaren Epicure. It is uncommon, so it's not going to be quite as prevalent as that card was in whichever Innistrad set that was, but a 1-mana 1/1 that does a bunch of value stuff. So how does this work out? Well, it's either a 1-mana 2/2 that gives you a bit of card selection. You can choose to put a card in your graveyard after all. Most of the time in Limited, you don't do that, but this set does have a heavy graveyard theme, as we'll see. So I think this time around in Ixalan, we're more likely to end up putting these cards in the graveyard than we were in the original Ixalan, where you almost never did it because, you didn't really want to draw a non-land most of the time, or you did want to draw a non-land most of the time. So basically, yeah, the Nizzanotes Scout is a 1-mana 1/1 that draws you a card if it's a land, and I mean, I know that doesn't sound exciting, maybe, but like, that's pretty insane. 1-mana 1/1 draw a card is great, even if that card's a land, and 1-mana 2/2 with some card selection, also pretty good. It means this card can stay relevant all game long because it can really help you, that effect ends up improving your card quality and so forth all game long. So that mechanic is back, but they also have a new mechanic that's sort of a different spin on it. So you have some cards that explore all on their own, but we also have map tokens in this set. We've got another uncommon 1-drop that gives you a ton of value for the cost to talk about for this particular mechanic, and that is Spyglass Siren, a 1-mana 1/1 flyer. When it enters, it makes a map token. So a map token is an artifact where you can pay 1 and tap it and sack the artifact to make a creature you control explore. So same mechanic we just talked about, except there's a token intermediary here before you get to actually explore. These map tokens are interesting because they interact with some other stuff going on in the set. There's some cards that can sack artifacts or give you value for artifacts, and obviously this is like a free artifact you have lying around. Additionally, there's a mechanic that cares about permanents going to your graveyard, and sacking map tokens will do that. So we've already seen some synergy here. So far, we haven't really seen the graveyardiness of this set. These two mechanics don't immediately scream that to you, even though Explore can put cards in the graveyard. But most of the other mechanics deal with the graveyard in some way, shape, or form, which is an interesting take on Ixalan. Original Ixalan, I don't feel like had a graveyard theme at all. It may have had like a small one, but this time around, it's like a graveyard set. It's like an Innistrad set in terms of how much you use the graveyard. So, for example, there are 4 different mechanics that are all interrelated that all involve the word descend. So let's start with a look at Brood Rage Mycoid. This is 3 generic and a black for a 4/3, and at the beginning of your end step, if you descended this turn, you make a black fungus creature token with this creature can't block. And then it says, the reminder text, you descended if a permanent card was put into your graveyard from anywhere. So, descending is pretty broad. It just has to be a permanent going to your graveyard. You can discard one from your hand. You can mill them. There's a mill theme in this set as you'd expect in a graveyard set. You can have a creature die, have any permanent die. You can sacrifice a map token. There's a lot of confusion sometimes with tokens, whether they trigger something like this. And the answer is that they do. They don't actually... Well, they do technically go to your graveyard and then they cease to exist. So they do trigger this because you do have a permanent go to your graveyard. So the map tokens work with this. And there are a lot of cards that give you some sort of value if you descend. And it's cool that it's as broad as it is. Like, permanent can go in any way, shape, or form. This means it works alongside sacrifice themes, which black-white looks like it has, for example. Works with mill themes, which blue-black has. So, it's going to end up being a mechanic that shows up a ton in this set, especially because there are 3 other descend-related mechanics. For example, we've also got something called Descend 4. This is on Didact Echo, which is 4 generic and a blue for a 3/2, enters the battlefield, draw a card, and it has flying as long as there are 4 more permanent cards in your graveyard. So not only is descending an action, it's also sort of a threshold-like mechanic where if you have enough permanents in your graveyard, you're going to be getting a bonus. And you get a pretty big one here. I mean, a 5-mana 3/2 that draws you a card is kind of okay already, but a 5-mana 3/2 flying that draws you a card, like, that's real good. And based on what we've seen from the set so far, it doesn't feel like it's going to be insane to manage to pull this off by turn 5. So this will often, I think Descend 4 is pretty doable, especially in blue, which has mill stuff going on, of course. These descend mechanics are going to be kind of interesting in terms of tension in the set, and by that I mean you have incentives in this set to play more permanents than normal because of all this descend stuff, so it may be a little less good to have instants and sorceries and heavy descend decks, because if you can have every card in your deck be a permanent, or almost every card, these cards all get way better, right? So, that's something to keep in mind. It'll be interesting to see how these decks actually shake out in terms of that kind of thing. But right now, it looks like there are going to be at least some archetypes where you're like, I'd rather play a permanent than like this medium removal spell, because why not? This is just going to be better with all my cards that say Descend on them. There's also Descend 8. So this one, as you would guess, requires you to have 8 permanents to get some value. We have it on Ukbin Bak, the Great Mistake, which is also the signpost uncommon for blue-black. It has this Descend 8 ability where you can pay 4 generic, a blue, and a black to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield. But you can only activate it if there are 8 or more permanent cards in your graveyard, and only as a sorcery. Does count itself because it's there when you use the ability. Descend 8 is obviously a lot more than Descend 4, but when the payoff is this good, like getting back a 6/4 Vigilance Menace, even a single time, which is all you can do for a reason I'll talk about in a second. But getting it back even a single time is often just going to win you the game. So if you're capable of milling yourself effectively, getting permanents in your graveyard again, if you've got cards that say Descend 8 on them, suddenly everything that's not a permanent becomes a lot less appealing to you. So, keep that in mind. This also has another new mechanic in the set that isn't really anything special or synergistic, and that is this finality counter thing. This means that if a creature dies and it has a finality counter, it gets exiled. So they've sort of simplified that text. Sometimes they have to put like a whole bunch of text that says like this gets exiled if it was descended or whatever. This simplifies that. I'm pretty sure it's going to end up becoming an evergreen thing because it is a good idea. It's good to mark that kind of thing, like with game pieces, as opposed to just having to remember them. But anyway, that's Descend 8 and finality counters. That's, having the finality counter thing makes sense in this set because some of these cards would be completely insane if they didn't get exiled, like Ukbin Bak here. And then the last of these descent mechanics, and you can see they're all interrelated. They're all graveyard mechanics that care about permanence. The last of these is called Fathomless Descent, and it's on a card like Song of Stupefaction, which is 1 generic and a blue for an aura, enchant creature, or vehicle. When it enters the battlefield, you may mill 2 cards. Enchanted permanent gets -X/-0, where X is the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. So Fathomless Descent means it's going to count literally every permanent in your card, whatever the effect is. And in this case, it lowers power. I'm never a huge fan of this kind of card, mostly because it never feels like it gives you a full card worth of value, because only lowering a creature's power doesn't really mean you traded one for one. The mill effect being here does obviously synergize with things, and it'll be interesting to see if that makes this better. But in general, obviously Fathomless Descent is like sort of the most powerful version of this effect, because it can count every permanent in your graveyard. So yeah, those are the 4 versions of Descent. You have cards that count when you discard permanents, or when permanents go to the graveyard in one form or another. Cards that check for the number of permanents in the graveyard at 4 and 8 specifically. And then cards that just care about every single permanent in your graveyard with Fathomless Descent. All right, so that is the Descent mechanics. Let's move now to the next mechanic, new mechanic in the set, which is Discover. We've got Geological Appraiser here. It's 2 generic and 2 red for a 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, discover 3. And the reminder text tells you, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card with mana value 3 or less, cast it without paying its mana cost, or put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom in a random order. So this is kind of a fixed version of Cascade. Cascade would trigger when you cast the thing. Additionally, Discover isn't always less mana than the card you cast. It just happens to be in this particular case. But either way, this mechanic is really strong, especially when it shows up on a creature. When you're playing something that adds to the board, and then you're going to get to cast a spell for free. Like, no matter what it is, you're getting 4 mana worth of value here. I mean, 4 mana 3/2 is obviously not good, but even if you get a 1 mana spell, you're going to feel like you're doing it. And if you hit something that costs 3, it can feel insane. One notable thing here that in some situations can make it better than Cascade, especially in Limited, where you don't have that much control over how you build your deck. Like, and you know, Cascade can really easily be abused, because you can have cards in your deck with Cascade that will only ever hit one other card in your deck, right? And that's, you know, insane and constructed. Harder to do that in Limited. And sometimes with Cascade in Limited, you end up hitting like a combat trick or something else that's not very good in the particular situation, something that you'd rather hold on to, and this lets you do that. So, you know, it's either a 4 mana 3/2 that draws you a card, that's a 2 for 1, or a 4 mana 3/2 that also lets you cast the spell. 99% of the time you are going to cast the spell, but there are going to be less weird feel-bad moments where you hit something that doesn't have a target, or, you know, things like that, and you can just put them in your hand when that happens, and I like that. So very powerful mechanic. It's going to, you know, when it shows up on creatures, like I said, is when it's going to be particularly good. Showing up on removal, showing up on anything that can already trade 1 for 1 gives you a really powerful card when you are discovering. Next new mechanic is called Craft. The example I have here is Spring-Loaded Saw Blades, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon artifact with flash. When it enters the battlefield, it does 5 to target tapped creature an opponent controls. So this is a permanent that's a removal spell. So it kind of works with Descend. It does seem like they did that a bunch, permanents that are removal spells, so that, you know, you end up more often with lots of permanents in your deck, and I think that's pretty cool. But what we really care about here is Craft with Artifact. So you can have Craft with any number of things. I think there's one that's as specific as Craft with 4 other cards with activated abilities or something like that. Most of them aren't that specific. They're like this. And what that means is you pay this mana value, which is 3 generic and a white. You pay that mana, and then you exile Spring-Loaded Saw Blades, and then an artifact you control or an artifact in your graveyard. So this is another mechanic that can be a graveyard mechanic. Obviously, this works with map tokens, which I think is really important for this particular card. Again, not all of them are Craft with Artifact. You have Craft with Creature, Craft with, you know, various other things as well. You just need various pieces either in play or in your graveyard, and then you can make this happen. And then when you do that, the thing with Craft comes back transformed. In this case, you get Blade Wheel Chariot, a 5/5 vehicle with crew 1. That already is pretty formidable, and you can tap 2 other untapped artifacts you control, and it becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. So, you know, neither side of this is like a completely insane card, but you have like a pretty good removal spell, and then a vehicle that's relevant on most board states on the other side. Obviously, both of these cards incentivize you doing artifact stuff. Map tokens especially are going to be your friend alongside both of these. So that's Craft. It's kind of a graveyard mechanic, but it doesn't have to be. But it is really nice that they designed these cards so that they work whether the thing's in your graveyard or in play. It means you're going to be able to make these things happen more often than you would otherwise be able to. And then the last thing that's not exactly a mechanic, I guess, but it is something I want to mention, is that there are special lands in this set that have the cave type. Cavernous Maw is an example. There's also a cycle of 5 common lands. I think they're common. They might be uncommon, but 5 lands that intertapped, produce 1 color of mana, and then they can all, you can pay 3 generic and whatever that color is to discover 4. So these are caves that let you, lands that let you get back a card worth of value later, which is always nice. But there are a few cards that pay you off for having caves, in addition to it just being, you know, a land subtype. And it looks like, you know, at the time I'm recording this, we haven't seen what all the archetypes are, but I think blue-green looks like it's going to end up being the cave deck, because there are a few blue and green cards that pay you off for having caves. And that would make sense. You know, blue-green often likes lands, so it would work as the archetype. But this Cavernous Maw, for example, really wants you to have caves around, because it can tap, and then for 2 generic, it can become a 3/3 elemental. It's still a cave land, but you can only activate it if you have total number in your graveyard and in play of caves of 3. So this is another thing that checks the graveyard. That means this can synergize with graveyard stuff in the set to some extent. It also means you can sack your caves that discover and still get cave payoffs for having them around. And this is how most of the cave payoffs work, which again, I think that's important because it makes all of these cards much more approachable in terms of the number of times you're going to be able to make them do their thing. So I always like lands that have, you know, special subtypes like gate or desert or whatever. They always make limited formats interesting, and I think the caves are probably going to do that to some extent. All right, so that's an early look at the mechanics in this new set. Looks like it's going to be graveyard-centric, which I think will be a pretty good time. Most of them look pretty interesting to me. I like the designs, especially on craft. I don't know how much I love the way they used Descend for like 4 different mechanics, or I mean, you could call it 3 if you want Descend 4 and 8 to be the same. It's a little bit weird in terms of design, but maybe it just ends up making more sense to people. To me, the fact that one of them checks specifically for when a permanent goes into the graveyard, and then the others check for number of permanents in the graveyard, it's a little weird, but I get it, and I think overall those mechanics will make for an interesting limited format. There will not be a Nizzanotes next week, but the good news is that's because the set review will be happening, so you'll have more limited content than you know what to do with. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.